The CDPRG, for which I'm the outreach coordinator, is a non-party affiliated organisation committed to advancing evidence-based drug policy reform. We work with organisations across the UK and the world to produce peer-reviewed original research, to fill in the gaps in knowledge about the UK's drug landscape, catalysing discussions with parliamentarians. We're supported by our unremunerated chairman, Crispin Blunt, and a policy council with policy and clinical research experts, including David Nutt of Drug Science, Fiona Measham of The Loop, and I'll be mentioning some of them in this talk, including human rights and cannabis law expert Melissa Bone. I'm also the press officer for Breaking Convention, which is Europe's largest psychedelic conference, and it will be back in all its glory in 2020. Please join us. And I'm the publicist for the Psychedelic Press, an independent book publisher with a quarterly journal dedicated to exploring psychoactive substances in history, science and culture from a kaleidoscopic cornucopia of perspectives. The next issue, with a beautiful cover by Edmund Griffiths-Jones, is out on the 26th of April. Now, one thing that's become clearer and clearer to me within the past 6 years in the field is that none of the thought leaders from anywhere within any drug research and policy networks are getting their information about drugs from the mainstream news. Why shouldn't they? Well, let's look at some national newspapers and how they present themselves. Giving you the facts, CNN. The New York Times seeks the truth and helps people understand the world. It's quite an interestingly sinister one. All of the news, entertainment, and more is in the Chicago Defender. Whether it's the Chicago News or National Stories, the Chicago Defender has got you covered. And the BBC informs, educates, and entertains wherever you are, whatever your age, weirdly reminiscent of the Argos catalogue. Now, we're all aware that the mainstream news isn't the best place to get information about topics we think most about. You'd never open a newspaper to learn more about what you do for a living or your passion in life, like horse riding. But we're guided, as these taglines show, to see the news as the best place to go for a digestible download on everything else. All of these taglines suggest that there's no need to read anything else at all, which in this information-rich and time-poor age comes across as a tremendous boon. I mean, obviously you know that you've got to read some other things to convey your emotional depth on Hinge, but it means for everyone to whom drugs isn't a hot topic, the sum total of what they find out about is acquired from major news outlets. And these always offer an attitudinal perspective more so than they do information. Now, the consequences of most people only having a media-wrought perspective on drugs wasn't always obvious to me. I studied English at uni with a master's specialising in Shakespeare, and I've worked in journalism and publicity ever since. I turned to drugs in 2016, having been personally horrified for some years by the cognitive dissonance between the realities of substance use in the UK and the seemingly ingrained social stigmas attached to the use of it. And as I came to understand more and more about the mainstream media's role in the perpetuation of this stigma, I also learnt about how the tangible effects of these shockwaves are disproportionately absorbed by our most marginalised communities, and how they result in risky drug taking and preventable deaths. And I became determined to see what I could do to exfoliate our collective consciousness. So the opening of my talk, Throwing White Powder on the Ghost, is a fairly layered reference to what we'll be getting into today. The mainstream media is often invisible, but practically tangible and by extension lethal, multifarious mechanisms of action upon our drug practices, perceptions, and policies. It's directly inspired by a sentence, a guiding premise from an incredible book published this year, Unbound, A Woman's Guide to Power. Cue drumroll, it's time to pull back the curtain and expose the inner workings of power, to make the invisible visible, to throw flour on the ghost. I cannot recommend this book highly enough. Its author, Cassia Rabanaic, trained as a Taoist nun while funding her studies practicing as one of the most accomplished dominatrices in the world. In these realms, she cultivated a uniquely penetrating understanding of the invisible mechanisms and forces at play in human interaction, insights she reveals in the book. By exposing the hidden complexities of the dynamics that we unwittingly engage in every day, we can upgrade our approaches to our day-to-day actions to become adroit movers through the inescapable mesh of social precedents. We become authors rather than the captive audiences that we have been trained to be of our future experiences. I saw an immediate parallel between the invisibility of the forces that Urbanaic reckons with in Unbound and their physical, consequential, perennial results, and our collective unawareness of the complexity of the relationships between the mainstream media and its various effects on our lives. We may think, before we think about it, that our perceptions of substances and substance use are our own, but just like human interaction, they're the product of a confluence of invisible factors. The invisible ties that the media has to different substances and people who use them percolate within our collective consciousness and have very real consequences in relation to drug policy and use outcomes. These outcomes are getting worse. The UK had 2,985 drug deaths in 2019, the highest number since record keeping began. Portugal, where problematic drug use is treated as a medical problem and affected individuals are treated as valued members of society, had just 63. In this talk, I hope to show, in the spirit of Urbaneic's work, to make the invisible visible, to throw some miscellaneous white powder from Shutterstock on some of the mechanisms that currently mold unchecked our perceptions and practices in relation to illicit substances. Before we get into the role of the media in relation to drugs and drug policy, let's get back to the prejudiced origins of the war on drugs. Confirming beyond any further debate that stigma is the driving force behind drug prohibition, Nixon's former aide John Ehrlichman confessed in a now very famous interview with Dan Baum in 2016 that it had never been about the drugs. The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and Black people. You know what I'm saying. They couldn't make it illegal to be from either of those demographics, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and Blacks with heroin and criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities, he says. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, vilify, break up their meetings, and crucially, vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. How do you get the public to associate anything with anything else? You tell lies to perpetuate stigma night after night on the evening news. So even with some positive reportage about psychedelic research recently, one of the most important things to remember about the mainstream media before we get into its mechanisms is that it is one of the primary weapons that has been used to wage the war on drugs, or rather, as it's known in drug policy, the war on some people who use some drugs. Racial profiling continues to be a huge problem in policing in the UK, with government figures from 2019 to 2020 showing Black people are 9 times more likely to be stopped and searched than white people, despite being less likely to use illicit substances. And white people, who are the most likely to use drugs, stop the least of any ethnic group. An example of how the premises of the war on drugs are continuing to support systemic racism. 2021 is the 50-year anniversary of Ronald Reagan's televised declaration of war on drugs, and it's definitely an appropriate time to be expunging its residue from our law enforcement protocols, as well as gaining greater clarity as to the media's role in promulgating its ideals. I have learned much from my work about what goes on when you take a given happening in psychedelic science or drug policy research and bring it to a news outlet. I've learned about what gears you need to shift into thinking into to reconceptualize the item, eking out the story that editors and publications will welcome into their folds. And more importantly, what necessarily during this process gets left on the cutting room floor and why. And even more importantly than that, the effects, the tangible, undeniable effects. I'm talking millions of preventable deaths worldwide and heightened social disadvantages that result not just from people using drugs, but from the chasm between reportage on drug use trends and what is taking place in reality, and how this complicates drug use. Now, we can all think of phrases that feel typical of mainstream media reporting. Breaking news, the incident occurred, increasingly concerned, eyewitnesses say, doctors worry, critics argue, scientists conclude. The configuration of these last two phrases, though, might well be swapped around if the scientists are revealing findings that point to evidence-based drug policy reform and the paper wishes to undermine it. The point is that reportage takes place in a by and large set vocabulary. The textual arrangement follows a set form when a happening comes into the newsroom to be covered. Itself an interesting term. When a happening passes through a process, it gets mediated and it comes out wearing a cover. Now, these stock stances and phrases are part of the reason why tropes in reportage persist, and we can see really clearly on drugs that this is why we get a lot of pieces that are the same year to year. Now, let's look at some of the narratives that commonly occur in relation to different substances. In relation to cannabis, this is really easy to do because they've been religiously collected in an ongoing book by an ongoing online blog project called Attacker Smoked Cannabis, and there's a book out by the same name. Some standout ones link cannabis to violence and killings. Dad causes glass to rain down on his baby in a rage over weed. Cannabis turned my lovely boyfriend into a violent monster. Bodybuilder killed cat after it ate his cannabis in Cornwall. I don't know if the cannabis can really be blamed in the last one because there's nothing to indicate that the cat didn't behave impeccably, but the implication by association is a very common trope in media. And people are always murdering or attacking people when they are cocaine-fueled. Here we have 2 cocaine-fueled drivers, a cocaine-fueled thug, and a cocaine-fueled beast, and the beast doesn't even get a hyphen. We'll talk more about the media's linguistic involvement in the dehumanizing of people who use out-of-favor drugs in a minute in relation to synthetic cannabinoids, aka spice. But it says a lot that these, just the first results that I Googled when I was looking for cocaine-fueled articles, illustrate the dehumanizing people who use drugs on such a totalistic scale. Now, some more gems from Attacker Smoked Cannabis. In several of these on paedophilia and sexual assault, the cannabis is given to the victim, but it's still presented as causal of attacker's behavior. In these ones linking to suicidality, it's suggested that cannabis is the cause, but there's unemployment, there's a veteran, rates of PTSD and suicidality are higher among veterans than in the general population. One of them has a history of mental health problems, another struggled with depression and anxiety for several years, but the overall implication is that it's all down to the cannabis. And the blog goes on to suggest links between cannabis use and terrorism and on the perils of cannabis-fueled driving. County Durham driver found with cannabis in system after travelling to take dog for a walk, slow news day. And finally, to offer warnings to those in doubt as to the intrinsicality of cannabis to the happenings reported. Those whose minds are steeped in cannabis are capable of quite extraordinary criminality. Your brain has been steeped in cannabis for most of your adult life, says judge in an article, Cannabis Smoking Leads to Criminality, Judge Tells Arsonist. In some cases, the link is asserted by the paper rather than the blogger, but it's still spurious. And it's really similar, and again, we'll come to this in relation to spice, to the 17th century presentation of coffee by priests and doctors as turning people inherently evil. With cannabis, the cultivation of these stigmas is incredibly unhelpful. It makes it harder for people who are using problematically to reach treatment services. It discourages conversations about cannabis that could prevent problematic use. And as my colleague Amber Moore talked about yesterday on 420 in relation to medical cannabis, it creates a host of problems discussed in the report she authored with Dave King around prescriber unwillingness and a pervasive lack of education about medical cannabis, which contribute to access barriers for the more than 1 million who need it in the UK. And in relation to both cocaine and cannabis, what we see here is a tragic presentation of a complex tapestry of circumstances that lead to the outcome covered, i.e. oversimplified and misleadingly represented as a single issue narrative, as though the cannabis or the cocaine is to blame rather than the interrelated factors, financial hardship, unmet physical and mental health needs, unemployment, trauma, being overstretched and under-rewarded by the demands of society. And these together are greater than the sum of their parts and lead up to the tragic happenings, which are then retroactively blamed on the substance involved. And this does 2 unhelpful things. It exculpates the powers that be from doing more to address the harder to resolve social problems in the background, meaning more incidents like this will continue to occur. And helpfully for those setting the status quo, it reinforces the status quo on drugs. How is the media so successful at reinforcing the status quo? I'm going to share some ideas on storytelling and the evolution of news now. Now, I'm unhealthily obsessed with this topic, and it was really hard to choose which elements of this to say. But I'm going to start with the equivalence of news consumption and substance dependency, using the garish caricature of raging addiction as addiction is portrayed in the news. And for this, I'll draw on the work of Alain de Botton. His News, a User's Manual, already invites the comparison between media and drug consumption from its outset. And just as the harm reduction community understands that whether or not substance use is problematic or not depends on the context, the manual promises some direction to steer the reader towards skillful news use rather than misuse or abuse. The presentation of news checking as a literary equivalent of fiending continues in the opener. It doesn't come with any instructions because it's meant to be the most normal, easy, obvious, unremarkable activity in the world, like breathing or blinking. After an interval, usually no longer than a night, and often far less if we're feeling particularly restless, we might only manage 10 or 15 minutes, we interrupt whatever we're doing in order to check the news. We put our lives on hold in the expectation of receiving yet another dose of critical information about all the significant achievements, catastrophes, crimes, epidemics, and romantic complications to have befallen mankind anywhere in the world around the planet since we last had a look. What follows is an exercise in trying to make this ubiquitous and familiar habit seem a lot weirder and more hazardous than it does at present. Just like psychoactives, the media mediates, i.e. changes the reality we live in, but more long-lastingly and without us consciously consenting to this, it's a side effect we don't think about as we tune in to the promise of facts and information and our fix. In these ways, the news goes against the founding fathers of the first wave of psychedelia, Timothy Leary's 2 commandments for the molecular age. 1, thou shalt not alter the consciousness of thy fellow man, and 2, thou shalt not prevent thy fellow man from altering his own consciousness. Now, there are a lot of ways in which the researchers of the psychedelic renaissance differentiate themselves from his more whimsical ways of conducting research, but these are the 2 things that even he as a maverick absolutely insisted upon. And the mainstream media, in the spirit of what Ehrlichman describes, making the public think prejudiced things after altering our collective consciousness while serving prohibitionist agendas, breach both. Now, the mainstream media and drug use comparison has been made elsewhere, and one of my favorite articles ever by Charlie Brooker ties it directly into the drugs debate. Writing about methadone prior to its transition from illegal high to Class B in 2010, he suggests that young people using methadone in relative safety would bear the brunt of our widespread newspaper abuse that has become so endemic it has crippled the country's ability to conduct a sensible debate about the war on drugs. Combined with a media screening festival calling to the ban in the lead up, if I was 15 years old, I wouldn't be typing this right now, he says. I'd be trying to buy plant food on the internet. And this time next year, I'd be buying it in a pub toilet, cut with worming pills and costing 4 times as much. I watched this set of predictions come true between 2010 and 2011 as an undergraduate at Oxford University. And indeed, according to the Office of National Statistics data, deaths from methadone rose for a few years after the ban. Furthermore, deaths from cocaine, which had been rising for 4 years previously, dropped sharply in 2008 and 2009, which experts have linked to the availability of safer, purer methadone than illegal high. I say this now so that we can get into the recalibration of storytelling and media stories with an understanding of the kinds of consequences at stake: lives. A little disclaimer. Our uncritical absorption of the mainstream media narratives is not our fault. Consuming rather than critiquing the media is what society and the media itself are collaboratively structured to encourage us to do. We go against the design of these systems when we begin to sharpen our critical thinking faculties and begin to distinguish between its agendas and our own, and to take back our agency in relation to forming perspectives on drugs. De Botton makes an interesting point about our critical thinking faculties being switched off in relation to the news. Half the world spellbound daily by mass media is the headline we don't see, and in education, it's deemed more important for us to decode the plot of Othello than to decode the front page of the New York Post. In fact, early modern literature contains some of the keys we need to break the spell and wake up from the slumber. Now, Othello is a great place to go for an understanding of the effects of misreporting. We as an audience are party to the deliberate doctoring of information as it changes hands between characters. The passing on of misinformation leads in an observable chain of events that we relish as the story, to the play's eventual tragedy, to the onstage deaths. Shakespeare puts messengers in his corpus 5 times more than any other playwright writing at the time. And across it, they provide a brilliant opportunity to explore what happens when information changes hands. Because the passing of information through a medium, it becoming media, always has a new dramatic or real for the characters effect. We know on one level, especially if we're involved in making the news, that it is a story. When writing press releases, I ask myself, what's the story? And that's the first thing you get asked if you pitch, if you haven't made it clear enough. But we've decultivated our ability to perceive a relationship between news stories and their negative consequences in real time. Now, it's quite a big jump from 1604 to now, so I'll pave the gap with a couple of bedtime stories. Media theorist and anthropologist Thomas de Zangatita discusses how we've come to be passive audience members over time, and according to him, it starts in childhood. J.M. Barrie's Peter and Wendy, 1911, engineers a sophisticated double communion between the words on the page. The adult story reader enjoys some harmless jokes at the child's expense about children being heartless, and the listening child just wants the story. But by the 1940s, books like Margaret Wise Brown's Goodnight Moon help adults use the story to set up real, effective sleeping conditions for the child to drift off. In Zangatita's words, that's what makes this little book representative of the shift to a more intensely mediated childhood. And this, as an audience, is the slumber that we've largely stayed in. Well, why is this good for newspapers? It keeps us receptive, and we, the audience, are their currency. They offer us an easily digestible global theatre, the sensation of being informed, and they offer us to the corporate and political directors of the global stage who fund and sanction the existence of the media platforms. A reciprocal relationship, but what do we get out of it as the audience? You can read more about this in our role as the audience in Manufacturing Consent, the Political Economy of the Mass Media by Edward S. Herman and Noam Chomsky. Crucially, there's no need for crude intervention to make sure that the media broadly upholds the powerful societal interests of its supporters, as this is normally accomplished by the editors and working journalists' internalization of priorities and definitions of newsworthiness that conform to the institution's policy. There's even room for voices of dissent and the reporting of inconvenient facts, because the beauty of the system is that such dissent and inconvenient information are kept within the bounds and the margins, so that their presence shows that the system is not monolithic, but they are not large enough to interfere unduly with the domination of the official agenda. Now, there are many well-intentioned journalists who know about the arguments for evidence-based drug policy reform, who pitch to write on the latest developments in the field, and that's a big part, but not the whole reason, of why there's been a groundswell of reporting on clinical research into psychedelic substances over the last few years. There are a lot of fantastic journalists who really care about the terrible state of the UK's mental health and public health and want to report on findings that can improve it. But the mechanisms of the media itself, as well as the structures behind the platforms, are set against them. Let's explore Chomsky and Herman's observations about the internalization of priorities across the organization in relation to the construction of an article. Now, an article is the product of several different departments within a media organization. Together, they uphold the overall stance of the publication, and the perspectives of any one mind working on the piece are diluted by the collective agenda of the others. Here's an example. It's split up into different parts. The article, which usually consists of a summary lead and then a few ostensible fact-based paragraphs, comes in last but get written first. The editing team will write the headline. In mainstream media, this is guided by maxims like sex sells, and if it bleeds, it leads. The sub-editor will add the subheading. You can see two here: strongest evidence yet, claim scientists, and rats used in experiments. This goes under the headline to expand on the article. Though they're written last, these garnishes are the bits that you see first and which powerfully shape the mindset with which you read the piece. And they might be all you read of it. Now let's talk about keywords. Rather than having their messages diluted by the others, a well-intentioned digital journalist may in fact have to thwart themselves in the first place. Clicks are analogous to paper sales, and it's a prerequisite to include keywords with high rankings in the piece. So even if a journalist knows that more factors than cocaine played into the accident they're reporting, the choice to use a high-ranking term like cocaine fueled once it earns its birthright in view of its already high rankings becomes less of a choice, more an obvious choice, in fact more of a requirement, and it'll be put in if you miss it out. Even so, it's rare for an article to peddle the propaganda of the war on drugs at the expense of facts to the extent that this one does. In fact, it won the Orwellian Prize for Journalistic Misrepresentation in 2011, which is an enterprise conducted by Oxford University neuroscience professor Dorothy Bishop. There's quite a complex scoring system, which she explains more on her blog Neurobonkers, but essentially this one won because it had factual errors in the headline, the subheadings, and the body of the text. Now, the original headline was just one cannabis joint can cause schizophrenia as well as damaging memory, and it was altered to this on complaints. And Dr. Matt Jones, co-author of the study, that was smothered by the coverage, said he was disappointed but not surprised by the article, and stated categorically, the study does not say that one spliff will bring on schizophrenia. Even if an article does get through all of the wording desks without the messages being undermined in any way, it could still fall foul of the picture desk and have a frivolous picture of teenagers smoking spliffs at festivals next to a really crucial message about the human rights abuses of the war on drugs. Or it could have a paratext extra to the article with an expert opinion undermining the messages in the article itself. Now, on the topic of bloody headlines, how helpful is the branding of GHB as a killer drug? Well, it moved from Class C to B this year. It has become increasingly visible in the media since last year. Here's an article written in November 2011 before the policy change. And here's another one written this year in March with the change confirmed. That's pretty much the only thing different about these pieces. Same staff writer, same term used, killer drug. The stock image is a different version of the same thing. Alex Aldridge mentioned yesterday in her brilliant talk on consent that it would be great if the coverage was wider in focus and scope, with educational information rather than just the same insistence that it's a killer drug. In fact, the recycling of this headline suggests incorrectly that GHB would be a killer drug in any context, and that the Class B label is a judicious evaluation of its static profile of harms. What will the effects of the rise from Class C to B have on use? It's too early to say, but I'm mindful of a 2012 paper by criminologists Fiona Measham and Karenza Moore. Fiona Measham is one of the CDPRG's policy advisors. It's called The Silent G, a case study in the production of drugs and drug problems. It has a really sophisticated discussion of what they call a conundrum with a lengthy history. Academic research into substance use can result in media representation and policy outcomes that exacerbate the substance's potential harms beyond what they were when the research was carried out. We see this with, for instance, the phenomenon birthed in the 1990s of ecstasy deaths. Fleshing out our portrayal of GHB as a killer drug, they believe it has stayed out of the political radar for so long relative to other substances because, in general, the lack of social problems related to its use. It's not associated with acquisitive crime like heroin or disorderly behaviour like alcohol. The concept of spiking and date rape needs its own talk, but suffice it to say that the mainstream media discourse on the topic has worsened the problem. As Jenny Valentish puts it in Woman of Substances, spikings do happen, but the bogeyman in the bar with a bottle of GHB in his back pocket is rare. Like rape, it is far more likely to occur in a domestic setting by a person who is familiar. The mainstream media cultivation over decades of the date rape phenomenon continues to leave people of all genders vulnerable to spiking in all sorts of contexts, while harm reduction practices inspired by the media myth see us shielding our drinks from spectral outsiders, and all the spikers who don't fit the profile, i.e. most spikers, hide under it like a fig leaf and go about their business efficiently. Now for some expert predictions. Adam Winstock of the Global Drug Survey says, people won't decide not to use GHB now because it's been moved from C to B. They'll just be less likely to seek help or advice. And for those who are caught, it may add another burden to their life. A criminal record is not helpful to anyone seeking to bring their life under control. And Imani Robinson of Release says, people won't decide not to use GHB now it's been moved from C to B. They'll just be less likely to seek help or advice. Says the move will further stigmatize and discriminate against people who use GHB, in this case, the LGBTQ plus community who engage in chemsex, and this is not progress. And these interviews both came out in an excellent analytical piece by in Dazed by Britt Dawson. We can look to the past if we want to understand the future, as Dr. Karenza Moore encourages in an article in The Conversation, not the mainstream press, about the Psychoactive Substances Act in 2016, why the PSA will be just another war on drugs disaster. Criminologists and sociologists anticipated it would expose more users to the dangers of the illicit market and would most severely impact the poorest and most marginalized, those in prison or on the streets using spice or synthetic cannabinoids. After the ban, the headlines said, drug policy is failing, just look at the zombies on our streets. Why does synthetic marijuana make people act like zombies? Is synthetic cannabis legal in the UK? And why are zombie drugs so dangerous? And if you think those are bad, wait for the drip. Rise of the zombies. Cheaper and more addictive than crack, spice is the synthetic drug that turns users into the living dead in minutes and is ruining lives across Britain. It's really similar to the presentation of coffee houses in the 1650s, which were used to stir up anti-Muslim, anti-Turkish sentiment, with broadcast banners depicting everyone in the coffee houses engaging in animalistic carnage and church pamphlets claiming health harms ranging from personality changes to impotence. 1 year on from the PSA's implementation, Rick Bradley, operations manager at Addaction, which is based in Kent, where prior to the ban there were more head shops than anywhere else in the country, said, you've now got a market that's in the hands of the criminal fraternity. You weren't going to go into a head shop and get mugged. It was a transition like anywhere else on the high street. Now young people go to street dealers, and this brings the additional risks of what the products might be mixed with on the street and risks around mugging, drug debts and sexual exploitation. I covered a Manchester Met University conference called Responding to Spice for Voltfast in 2017, where Dr. Moore's predictions and Rick Bradley's observations were further confirmed by substance misuse commissioners and academics, including substance use specialist Rebecca Askew. Going some way to rehumanizing the people this is all about, check out her Drug Policy Voices project and podcast with CDPRG policy advisor Dr. Melissa Bone, which aims to bring the voices of people who use drugs into the political discussion. There's also a great little interview on the CDPRG's YouTube with Melissa talking about the need for everyone's voices to be represented in drug policy, which I'll pop in the chat. And there's an amazing book called Spice Boys by Peter Morgan, a support worker with over 15 years experience working with Manchester's homeless population. It's a true life novel tracing the impact of the PSA on the lives of 4 young people addicted to spice. And here's a picture he took of the tent community living in Manchester in 2016. Now, there's a really important relationship between the media and fiction that confesses itself to be fiction. I'm going to call them media and fiction in this discussion, but that's not to suggest that media presentations of the issues are any more real. UK soap operas very often introduce storylines that are already hot topics in the mainstream media. This used to involve for too many characters and too many programs to name, signifying a bad character by their substance use. And there have been some really refreshing positive changes more recently. Coronation Street's Izzy Armstrong, who has a connective tissue disorder, sought cannabis for pain relief in the soap in 2016, an opportunity to raise many issues covered in our cannabis report, which relate to the inadequate provision of medical cannabis in the UK, and a portrayal that has been praised by drug policy reformists, including Peter Carroll. In 2020, Hollyoaks worked with the Children's Society to develop a plotline on county lines gang dealing and highlight how an issue can affect a community. And the Children's Society say, our practitioners met scriptwriters and researchers offering insight into the grooming process, ensuring the story is realistic. We also met young cast members and their parents, and some of the adult cast to advise on how they might feel and react on screen as the exploitation takes hold. Perhaps we are seeing the emergence of a dynamic where, free from some of the shackles that bind journalists, as we've discussed before, and the time to research, the creators of fictional media can do proper research and manifest it in a less doctored form than the mainstream media in the media they create. Baltimore, where The Wire is set, will no longer prosecute drug possession. It was announced on March the 27th of this year. Nearly every mainstream news source across the pond and over here invoked The Wire itself for their introductory portrayals of Baltimore as a den of iniquity prior to the legislation, The Independent calling the policy change a plotline straight out of The Wire. Even if it had to go through a book set to get there, it's heartening to see the incredible research and knowledge that went into The Wire. Writing partners David Simon and Ed Burns are a former police reporter and homicide detective, making its way into the real-life global media discourse on drugs. What can we learn from the future? Well, Rachel Carson, the biologist who warned about the dangers of DDT, wrote adroitly in both academic and fictional forms. And her Silent Spring, published in 1962, begins with a fable for tomorrow depicting a world shorn of wildlife by DDT pesticides. It's a scientific educational book written in a literary style and written because of her observation that the average purchaser is completely bewildered by the array of available insecticides, fungicides, weed killers, and has no way of knowing which are the deadly ones and which are reasonably safe. With the powers that be deliberately poisoning our food and then policing the result, a parallel can certainly be drawn between new university students arriving to find a pharmacopoeia of substances and little harm reduction guidance, and then being retroactively blamed for drug deaths, the kind of culture in which Drugs and Me was set up. Now, Carson was vilified by the pesticide industry and the press for the rest of her life, slammed as a fiction writer and not a scientist because of the fable for tomorrow at the start of her book. But after her death, the dangers of DDT were recognized and its use was banned in the USA in 1971. And many of her other predictions about the social shifts needed to protect the environment have been borne out in reality over the ensuing decades. Here and Now Studios, We Call It Parlor, is likewise a fable for tomorrow, with some important messaging on ensuring that the medicalization of psychedelics is carried out with integrity. As we move excitingly into a new era of awareness and commercial interest in the research and development of psychedelic-assisted treatments, it's important that these treatments, which continue to be needed by millions around the world, are developed in a way that maintains the integrity of the original psychedelic research. breaking conventions, Ali Biner recently released a film called The Rise of Psychedelic Capitalism on YouTube and speaks to clinicians, economists, and patients about how to make sure that this happens. In an interview looking at systemic racism and how it's shrined into drug policy in the US and much of the rest of the world, Cassandra Frederique of the UK Drug Policy Alliance quotes Audre Lorde's learning from the 60s. There's no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives. She underscores the importance of acknowledging this in drug policy reform. There is no naloxone for racism. When we compare the mainstream media's presentation of anything drug-related to that of academic discourse and a lot of fictional representation, what we very often see is a single issue presentation of a situation shorn of its complexities and made just about the drugs. And as Nixon's aide, John Ehrlichman, has laid out for us, it's never been just about the drugs. But because of how the media has overlaid our collective consciousness for years, it can never be just about the drugs. It's almost always about the marginalization of the human or population group who's being discussed in connection to the drugs. In The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House, Lorde explains how feminism with a white heterosexual bias can never liberate all women from patriarchal bondage. Only by building diversity into strategies to effect change will meaningful totalistic change be brought about for everyone. She teaches us to become consciously aware of the unconscious prejudices within us all, reach down into that place of knowledge inside ourselves, touch that terror and loathing of any difference that lives there, see whose face it wears, and then the personal and the political can begin to illuminate our choices. Not only is the mainstream media's treatment of drugs breaking Timothy Leary's commandments, but the ways it has influenced our consciousness over decades advance prejudiced agendas that divide us as people, presenting the diverse array of prejudice they peddle as a single issue reporting on drugs. And we know what to expect from it, and clearly we need our own tools. Only by making a far more diverse range of perspectives far more visible from people researching substances and using them, can we begin to redress the damages that the mainstream media, wielded in the name of the war on drugs, has inflicted on our collective consciousness. So now we've thrown the white powder on the ghost, here's a harm reduction guide to mainstream media use. So these are some things that we can all do right now. We can use a trusted source. What else has the writer written or said? Just as it's safer to buy from a seller whose product you know than someone in the dark at a festival after you've had the drugs you tested at home confiscated on the way in, academic peer-reviewed research is a better place than the mainstream media to find facts, and drug policy and harm reduction websites are the best place to find experts, like those on the CDPRG's Policy Council. Watch Talks, the Breaking Convention YouTube channel, is a really incredible resource. Apply a reagent test. How has the piece been funded? Are there any commercial interests relating to the specific piece? What are the other agendas of the funders to the overall outlet? What are the background political leanings? Dip low, go slow, read widely over time. One article's never enough to have an opinion. Set and setting. Have you sought it out or has it popped up on your feed? Remember, if it's in the mainstream press, the length of time you linger on their heat map is their currency. If it's popped up on your feed, that's algorithm over agency. Big tech wants you to see this, try and find the stuff that it doesn't. Now, never fiend. If you're checking mainstream media several times a day, that's problematic use. Consciously build it out of your routines to check the habit. Check in on your friends. Put ideas in context together. Just like we check our friends are doing okay at a rave, drug-related media coverage can throw up upsetting takes on topics, especially leaving people feeling stigmatized. Check in on each other and share quality information you come across. Less is more. Get topics from the media, microdose, and then research elsewhere. The media is a great source to find out what are the drug-related hot topics, but then go and research them somewhere else. It's a way to dilute the mainstream media's influence on your psyche and make it sub-perceptual. But like microdosing, it's probably notoriously difficult to take little enough. Use the breakout spaces. Get off the beaten track. If the mainstream media is the equivalent of being at the front on the left next to the speaker, you'll exhaust yourself if you spend all your time reading things there. Chill out with longer thought pieces or podcasts. This also relates to something Cypress editor Nikki Weird says in the introduction of the new journal. When you close the mainstream motorways, as psychedelics do by suppressing our default modes of thinking, this opens up for paths less traveled to be taken. But you obviously don't need to take psychedelics or anything else to decide to read more interesting things. Now, some things that the media can do, and please get in touch with me if you're a journalist with thoughts about writing on drugs. My email's on the next slide. Read before you roll. One for the journalists. Some guidelines for reducing stigmatizing reporting already exist. Here's one set made in 2012 by the UK Drug Policy Commission, and the CDPRG will be looking at developing some more current ones for the national press. Please get in touch if you'd like to know more about this or talk about your experiences of reporting on drugs. A new status quo can be established where it becomes unacceptable to invoke stigmatizing tropes that bear no relation to the facts. Sharing is caring. Broadcast harm reduction information. In the Netherlands, they broadcast the results of pill testing services to warn clubbers of ones to avoid. Without prejudiced agendas holding its tongue, the mainstream media could be really active in helping to reduce drug harms. And now, never use the word drugs, be substance specific. This is one that Dr. Lenny Gibson of the Dream Shadow Group really reinforced last week at the Psychedelics of Philosophy conference. I've used it a lot in this talk, and it's really hard not to. So I'd qualify, never use the word drug if you're speaking outside the echo chamber or writing about it in the media. It's unhelpful, it's shrouded in media-wrought preconceptions through the ages. See Toby Snedden's The Genealogy of a Regulatory Concept for more on this. When you use the word drugs, you invoke them all, and you open the door to the well-populated media circus of cliche, shadowy characters. You'll have all the dead celebrities and zombies that the media have been fleshing out for years sitting there gurning alongside you as you attempt to introduce a new perspective. Your attempt to effect change in a mind will be like a minnow going through the tide of an ocean, and everyone deserves the chance to change their mind. So to wrap up, there's some things I would have loved to include but couldn't for time, and also some details about the CDPRG, including our social media links and contact details. And thank you so much for hosting me.
Awesome. If we could give Rawls a little round of applause, that was incredible. Great. Let me go back to my view. All right. Wow, that was incredible. There's so much in there that I want to I want to expand upon, and I'm happy that you included a little related issues, because that was one of my first questions was what did you not include, which you could have, even though that was dense. But I'll get into the questions first from our audience. I'd also like to note that Roz is tuning in from Mexico, so she's another one of our international speakers, and we're very lucky to have her. Rosie asked, how do you think this stigmatization might impact people struggling with addiction? So I think that was from earlier in your talk about the kind of cocaine fueled headlines of drug users and things like that.
That's a really interesting question. And so actually, weirdly, with relation to cannabis and cocaine specifically, which though I don't think they're in any harm reduction guise as particularly synergistic drugs, but there's a really good discussion of kind of stigma around addiction in relation to cannabis and cocaine in a report by Vars called the Black Sheep Report, which is about problematic cannabis use in the UK. And people who have problematic cannabis use often feel like they don't want to seek help at the same places where people are being treated for heroin addiction and crack cocaine addiction. And so it creates this kind of stigma within a demographic that would, of course, be stronger together, and where it would be great to have solidarity and help everyone. And I think in Portugal, for instance, where everyone gets tailored individual help to address their problematic substance use with the idea that there's nothing wrong with needing that help. I don't think that there is such, people seeking cannabis help was on the rise last year and this year in Portugal. So I feel like that divide isn't evident. I feel like there's a really interesting distinction between people who have problems with licit and illicit drugs, because I think alcohol in some ways is one of the hardest substances to have a problematic use relationship with, because you get confronted with walls of it whenever you leave the house, and then everyone else is allowed it but not you. But then at the same time, there's a really, really great blog post by Will Haydock, who researches stigma in relation to alcohol in particular, and it discusses how with alcohol, there are types of users who get demonized. So like the binge drinkers get vilified, the homeless get vilified. But with drugs, there's a sense that there's an inherent sinfulness to the drugs themselves. And I think that creates, when you've got an illegal substance that you have a problem with, that creates an additional layer of like feeling like you can't seek help from it. So I feel like there's loads more to say, but I hope that goes some way to answering.
Yeah, absolutely. Rosie, if you want to respond, you're more than welcome to. Otherwise, we can move on to the next question. But yeah, that was a excellent response. There's many different avenues there. Rosie did have a subsequent question, which was, are there any media outlets which you feel do not actively engage or do not actively encourage stigmatization on topics, maybe independent papers, or is this inevitable in all media?
So there are many really, really brilliant journalists. So one who springs to mind immediately is Jenny Valentish, who I mentioned in my talk. And I cannot recommend her book, Women of Substances, highly enough. She's been into great detail researching all of the ways in which substance use services are kind of based on research into men's like problematic substance use. So there aren't like, even though like women are obviously going through these services and need the treatments, they're not actually optimized for women, and that's why they can be like less user friendly for women than they are for men. And she's written in loads and loads of national papers. I realize I'm kind of like focusing on freelancers rather than outlets at the start of this question, but another who springs to mind is J.S. Raffaelli. And he's a journalist who co-wrote a really incredible book called Good Cop, Bad War with Neil Woods, who was an undercover drugs cop for many, many years, and very, very quickly came to realize that he was facilitating the harms of the war on drugs from the front lines while having absolutely no effect on supply or demand. And he now chairs an organization called LEAP, which is a large and growing organisation of law enforcement professionals who would prefer there to be evidence-based drug policy. And J.S. Raffaelli is part of the team at Vice, which has Vice actually has an entire drugs department, and the drugs editor at Vice is Max Daly, who's an incredible investigative journalist who's been writing really in-depth pieces about drug-related issues for years. So I would say that I think Vice in the old days before Max came into it, it used to have quite an objectifying portrayal of drug use, where it would be like, look at these type of people using this drug in this way. But I think particularly like last year when all of the stuff was coming out about kind of the racist use of stop and search by UK police, Vice kind of really stepped up and was one of the flagship places where you could go to read fantastic journalism. So yeah, I guess that would be my main one. But then VoltFast, which was set up to provide kind of a clear-sighted perspective on drugs and kind of to be an antidote to a lot of what was going on in the mainstream press. They've still got a really incredible team of journalists working with them, producing amazing stuff. And yeah, those would probably be my top two go-to, but I feel like it's really hard to do this question justice on the spot. So I might send you all a follow-up list of other recommendations later, because I feel like I'm going to be kicking myself for not having included more.
Yeah, please do. I mean, yeah, I think that's an excellent start, though. I mean, I hadn't heard of J.S. Raffaelli, and I know that I think Amber was talking about that book that he wrote with Niall Woods yesterday as well. So that's something going to be on my reading list. Yeah, awesome. So Ivan has asked, how should organizations advocating for changes in drug policies and drug education use some of the media tools you've mentioned in their visions and message to get their visions and messages across? If they do, wouldn't they be committing the same, quote, sins that you flagged?
I think that's a really interesting one, and it's one that I kind of struggle with every day in the role of trying as hard as I can to get publicity about the amazing work that's going on into mainstream outlets. And to that, what I would say is there's some absolutely incredible journalists working at all of the major papers and internationally and nationally, and they completely get it. And their presence within the machine is a really, really like heartening kind of indication that we can get there, because like the more people you have who aren't sharing the agendas from on high, the more we can try and get kind of realistic reporting, the more we can expunge these tropes. So it's really, really worth still trying to get your messages into the mainstream press. It's just, I think what I was trying to show mostly with this talk is that we've all got to take responsibility for not just kind of absorbing what comes out of the mainstream press. So yeah, put into it, but don't take from it is what I would say, because every time you get covered as an organization doing this work, that you come away going, well, they didn't mention that bit, or I specifically hoped that they'd mention this, or like they cut the really salient bit, or they changed that phrase. But you're still getting something out there, and it's still worth it, and it's still bringing the project as a whole to people's attention. But if you can, as I think like Imperial College are probably doing with the coverage of the latest psilocybin and antidepressant study, if you can flank the mainstream coverage with kind of, here are some more nuanced bits that we suggest you read too, maybe in your newsletter, etc., then you can kind of enjoy the ebullience of the mainstream coverage, but also kind of make sure that the nuances come across too. So yeah, I'd say like be responsible for your own feeds, have a newsletter, like create your own stuff. Like I feel like lots of people have said this, and I can't remember who said it first, but like the only possible way to have a truly independent press is to create it yourself. So yeah, I'd say definitely do try and put stuff in there, but complement it with your own stuff.
Yeah, excellent. I think that ties in very nicely with Annie's question. If you'd like to ask that, Annie.
Yeah, sure. It was one of the kind of, I think it was on your recommendations of what we can do as kind of individuals. And so I asked, like, how can we make academic research kind of more accessible to the general public? Because it's great for kind of uni students to say to themselves, yeah, I'm going to read more academic material and educate myself about these things. But I mean, for somebody who's not in my position of like being used to reading academic articles, that's quite difficult to do. So what do you think about kind of blogging and, individual outlets that we can use in terms of like social media and things like that?
I think blogging's a great one, and weirdly, one of the very first things that springs to mind is No Fear Shakespeare, which I kind of remember from like GCSE days. It has the kind of unintelligible Shakespeare text on one side, and then it has kind of the kind of modern colloquial translation. And I think it would be very, very well worth having the academic that I mentioned from Oxford, who kind of rates papers for their Orwellian factual errors, has a blog where she kind of takes down the factual errors, but it's academic, it's not accessible to someone that's kind of a newcomer to these issues. But I think there is definitely space for not just a blog, but memes that kind of take a simplified version of a news article and then put next to it really simply what kind of a non-discriminatory harm reductionist perspective might be, or kind of where the missing safety tips are, or where people might be led into like dangerous use practices if they were to take the article at face value. I think there's so much room for that, and I think Ivan's so right that kind of memes go viral, like anything, like if we use the tools that we have at our disposal, we're all capable of creating content that our friends will find funny and our friends will find accessible, and it doesn't matter if not everyone does, but that's a way to just kind of get antidotes to apocryphal information out there.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's definitely now that's kind of inspired me to go and, I don't know, I'm going to go and revamp our blog at DNA. And like you said, it's about kind of getting that nuance across. So if you can do that, then I mean, we can only hope for the best. Thank you.
Definitely. And I think like one way in which the mainstream press is actually good is it does pique a lot of people's curiosity, and people do ask me like, oh, I'm just hearing about psychedelic psychotherapy now, and it's a really, really good chance to go, oh, here are some websites that you might like, and to kind of like bring people into the idea of the existence of drugs and me. Like the Third Wave actually as well has really good kind of introductory guides to different substances and kind of their somatic effects, which I think is a really important and often missing part of school drugs education. And like, yeah, there's definitely if you're creating your own content, there's so much that you can do to kind of ride the wave that's been precipitated by the mainstream media in a positive way.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you. Really, really interesting stuff. So Rosie has another question, and she asked, when working, have you ever been in a situation where your editor has pushed you to write something which enforced a rhetoric you disagreed with?
That's a really good question. I have mostly written for drug evidence-based drug policy publications. So I've been really lucky. I think my first ever piece was Volt Fast, and then I've written for Symposia. I've written a lot for the Third Wave. So I've mostly had the pleasure of having like Louis Greenstein springs to mind as one of the like most amazing editors I've ever had, but I've mostly had editors who kind of helped me tease out ways to bring in other drug reform messaging. But I wrote a piece for The Guardian once, and I definitely didn't approve of the title it ended. No, I definitely did approve of the title it ended up with, and it was much more newsy. But I'd written a kind of very kind of sciencey title that was hoping to get across like a lot more than you can put in a headline. And I've definitely helped and assisted in the creation of a lot of pieces where because that's a lot of what I do is I put journalists together with people that are making this research happen, and a piece results from that. So I'll often suggest like, why don't you pitch this, and then like kind of assist with like the angles to take in the hope that drug policy reform messaging gets into the eventual piece, and a lot of that will end up getting edited out. I think one phrase I remember taking issue with that got added to a piece about MDMA was the insistence on calling it the powerful drug, which I think in a context of clinical research on MDMA subtly but unnecessarily stirs up the idea of its kind of connectivity to ecstasy deaths, when in fact there's never been a clinically administered fatality, which Ben Sessa talks about a lot in his amazing research on MDMA and alcoholism. But yeah, the divorcing of MDMA and ecstasy deaths from current clinical research, while of course people are still dying of super strength MDMA and a lack of harm reduction information, is something that like needs to continue. And I think the media, having created the problem in the first place, isn't doing enough to kind of be careful with language to help make that divide.
Yeah, wow, that's so true, and I completely agree. Ben Sessa's work is really interesting. I saw a talk with him a couple of months ago with the York Psychedelic Society, and he was talking about how the come down is actually more a function of kind of everything else that you were doing with the MDMA,
Yes,
like
and then
staying up very late.
swaddle that into the conceptualization of what MDMA therapy must be like, and like, as he says more eloquently, kind of don't blame it on the lack of sleep and the cigarettes and the terrible food and the gurning, when in fact like none of those things are a feature of clinical MDMA. And I think there needs to be I think technical portrayals of what actually goes on when you experience any of these therapies are something that are kind of not quite present enough in the mainstream media yet. And I think another thing that this kind of leads me to is the language that we use around describing what you might expect to feel when you have a therapeutic experience. It's still very much about kind of like having a reset, or kind of other things that you can't really necessarily relate to as a layperson, particularly if you've never taken psychedelics for any kind of recreational reason before in your life. That's not how you talk. And there's a fantastic podcast by Myco Meditations, which is a retreat in Jamaica, and that has interviews with people who've been through the retreat. And there's one that really sticks out to me where this girl kind of really comes to terms with some horrific things and transcends them, and she sees a lot of her suffering as this giant purple spiral that envelops her when she's in the experience. And I think we need more kind of like real person languaging of these things in order to kind of make it more accessible and more conceptually like approachable to more people. So that's something that I hope we can see, particularly if we can kind of diversify the discourse in some of the ways that I hope.
Yeah, absolutely. That was like almost exactly what Ivan was saying earlier as well, with the necessity of actual like supportive and protective drug memes, so that people have a kind of an awareness that goes beyond just yeah, what the media is feeding us. But I guess so. I think we've gone through all the questions in the chat, but I do have one or two just for you. I mean, we've talked a lot about media and the way that it manipulates information in order to give a certain narrative, basically. How do you have any tips or resources that we can use to help refine our own kind of bullshit detector and like filter out all the yeah, all the kind of nonsense and manipulation that we actually are absorbing all the time.
So the first thing that comes to mind is a talk that I saw in 2016 by Joanne Sest, who's an academic at Columbia University. And that was actually where I first saw that quote about John Ehrlichman at Harper's Bazaar. And it's a really, really interesting discussion. So I think it's the LSE Institute of Ideas where it was first, where it was given. I can send a link around later, but it's basically about kind of the patients versus criminals narrative and all of the subtleties in how we conceptualize addiction and the treatment of addiction, and often while meaning to give holistic treatments, we are still kind of keeping people trapped in a kind of stigmatic, segregated place. And it really, really cleverly pinpoints all of the kind of linguistic changes that we would need to make in order to kind of reconceptualize that and be sure that we're kind of not othering people when we consider that they might need some help with problematic substance dependency. And it looks at addiction treatment programs from like really, really horrific ones where people are basically kept in the equivalent of a prison, and then all the way through to Portugal where people get kind of tailored support and like their drug use might like be evaluated as not being a problem after all. And yeah, it's a really, really clever linguistic analysis. So I think, yeah, that's probably the first place I'd go. And then there are other guides already about reporting, and I wanted to get a catalogue together for this. And again, that's something I can send. But several, I think there's one that's been put together by the Canadian Psychedelic Society, I think, or a group in Canada, about kind of ways of reporting on drugs and drug-related issues without stigmatizing. And I feel like reading those is definitely a good way to kind of identify the language. But also, if you just go to kind of any website where they're doing amazing research, like Release or Transport, just read anything on talking drugs, anything on Release, anything on our website. Hopefully, I'm going to go over it with a fine-tooth comb to make sure that's the case. But like anyone working in kind of the promotion of evidence-based drug policy is going to be using language correctly. I mean, I think all of our websites are riddled with the word drug, but that's because you have to buy into the semantics that are being used generally if you want to make changes generally. But yeah, I think like basically, like I should have mentioned Transform as well if I hadn't. But any of those websites are going to be full of kind of the correct language, and also probably teach you some things about like why they're using it along the way.
Awesome. Yeah. It's reminding me of your tips at the end, which I think will be very helpful for me to go back to and listen to, and also disseminate through DNA and make sure that all of our followers know what's up. I guess my last question is, you mentioned briefly this thing called so first of all, one of my favorite books is Aldous Huxley's Island. But you mentioned this like organization, Here and Now Studios. We call it Paula. I was wondering if you could explain that a little more.
So Parla is a futuristic fable. So actually, Island, interestingly, I learned this I'm staying with my friend Rianne Crane, who's a Huxley scholar at the moment, and she's writing about Island, and it was released the same year as Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. We call it Parla is very much in the same spirit. It's a kind of cautionary tale, and it's about this bright-eyed young adult who has an LSD experience. It's wonderful. She decides to start a psychedelic clinic. She can see that all of the suffering that she wants to alleviate is global, so she dreams big, and she starts a psychedelic clinic that gets like loads of investment, but then it turns out to be just one of many psychedelic clinics that all spring up at the same time. And of course, like very much true to what's going on at the moment, a lot of people are attracted to the space, and distinctions need to be made between people that are attracted to the exciting new investment opportunities, but are still going to want to further fantastic aims of the original movement and people who are just excited to the investment opportunities. And we call it Paolo basically gets to a place where it's no longer possible for her clinic to provide the kind of therapy that had the spirit she originally intended to give it with. And I think that's something that is a worry in the psychedelic movement at the moment, that people will kind of commodify psychedelic therapies in a way where you're on a lifelong healing journey, rather than like you can have these experiences that set you up, which are also possible, and to kind of go in and top them up every few years. But yeah, I think there definitely is a worry that kind of the research and development could be denatured by some companies into kind of being something that's against the spirit of the whole thing. And then there's also kind of attempts that, I mean, this takes me back to when someone tried to patent ayahuasca in, I think, the 80s. They tried to patent the process of mixing the liquid in the vine to create the brew. And I think there is a tendency to want to kind of want to push agendas in that are not the agendas of kind of bringing psychedelic therapy to the world. But the Arian project, which behind We Call It Parla, are bringing out a sequel, and I think there's a Patreon where you can support it. And that's going to be kind of like looking at where we're at now and where we might go again, I believe. So yeah, I think there's more of the same that will be some really good pause for thought.
Wow, yeah, that's amazing. I will definitely be checking that out. And it does remind me, like what you just said about, I brought this up with Greg Donaldson on Monday, how I think Compass Pathways had tried to patent like the lighting or the specific clinical setup of like psilocybin rooms to do treatment in, and it's just kind of like,
I
what's
think
the real
there's
end
all
game
sorts
here?
of patenting ideas floating around the space at the moment. There's an incredible expert on this he's called Graham Palinchek, and he's works with the psilocybin alpha team, and he's like the psychedelic patent specialist, but also very much kind of operating with integrity within the space. He's got great psychedelic knowledge as well, and he's kind of looking both academically and practically at like what's going on with psychedelic patents right now. So it's definitely his field of expertise, much more than mine or anyone else I can think of, but I'd highly recommend checking out his research and anything he's written on it. I think he might have written stuff on psilocybin alpha, I'm not sure, but he's like the name in the field.
Awesome. Yeah, I will definitely be checking him out. Well, I don't think we have any more questions from the group, and I mean, I'm I'm still filled with questions, but I want to let you get on with your day. So thank you very much for
the conversation. Kind of generally, this has been such a pleasure.
Awesome. Well, I mean, I also need to say thank you very much publicly, because you've helped us contact a lot of the speakers that we have, and yes, Transcending Taboo is very much indebted to your help, Roz. So thanks for the work that you do. And yeah, I look forward to, we can even do this again in the future. It'll be wonderful.
Definitely. And thank you so much all for coming. And yeah, this has been so much fun.
Awesome. Have a great rest of your day. Thanks everyone for tuning in.